I'm going to resist trying to bust a couple rhymes real quick as I have you all as a captive audience. Before I get started, let me introduce myself a little bit. So in addition to being an English instructor at San Diego City College and the founder of Pillars of the Community, I come from a long line of people who have, despite the odds, refused to sit down and let themselves and let those around them kind of be choked and be prevented from being able to breathe and being able to survive and being able to live in this country. My great-grandfather, my grandfather's father, was a runaway slave who ran away to an Indian reservation. I'm still holding the mic up, I've got to bring it back down. Who ran away to live and raise his family on an Indian reservation in Omaha, Nebraska. My grandfather, who was a communist organizer, left at a very early age, jumping trains, began working in unions, was friends with Paul Robeson, but continued to organize kind of throughout the country and also arguing that people all deserve to be able to earn a wage that will be able to provide them with a way to live. That people, regardless of their color, deserve the same respect as everybody else. Because of that effort, he was blacklisted and forced to open up a shoe repair store in Los Angeles, eventually moving the family to Oakland, where my mother joined the Black Panther Party and had the opportunity to really fly around the world and represent the Black Panthers in places like Japan, where they recognize kind of the common struggles that are happening all over the world. And then I became Muslim in 1995, 6 years before 9/11. I have a cough. I think it's just an allergic thing. I don't think I'll get you all sick. If I do, I apologize. I say all of that to kind of to give a background to why I started Pillars of the Community and why this subject is really interesting to me. And sitting and hearing Dr. Narmala's presentation, I wish I had the ability to fast forward in life, sit through this entire conference, and then come back and present because of all the really amazing things and the intersections between what you talked about and kind of what I'm going to try to go over in the presentation here. If there's any questions, if I offend anybody, if anybody really, really agrees and want to say how much they agree, feel free to interrupt me. I'm not used to the lecture style so much, and this is one of my first times actually even using PowerPoint, so I was just like, why not go for it? So the title of this presentation, Brian, how much time do I have? Okay. I might need, I always start off thinking that I'm not going to have enough, I'm not going to be able to fill up the time, but as most professors, I end up kind of over speaking. So hopefully the PowerPoint will help keep me on point. So I can't breathe. How the ballot box was used to choke Black America. Let's see if I can do this. So Frantz Fanon has this quote, I think, that has been getting a lot more attention lately, where he talks about when we revolt, it's not for a particular culture. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe. Because of current affairs, because of things that we've seen in the media lately, kind of who comes to mind, and I'm asking this, who comes to mind when we start thinking about I can't breathe? Eric Garner, right? So we have Eric Garner. We have other people who have been attention has been brought to them through the Black Lives Matter movement, through media coverage, through a number of different incidents, where police brutality has really become kind of a topic in the media. It's been a topic by politicians. Here's Alfred Alongo, somebody who was in El Cajon, this is maybe a year and a half ago, who was murdered by police in El Cajon. He was holding, I think it was a vapor cigarette or something like that, and murdered by the police after his sister had called the police to say, hey, can you come and help me? My brother's out here acting erratic. But typically when we talk about police brutality, typically when we talk about state violence, we think about physical violence. We think of these people who have been murdered. We think about people who have been beaten, and we've caught those videos on tape. But as Narmala kind of alluded to, there's another violence that we have here in the United States historically. A violence that's kind of indented and impressed on our minds, a concept of race, a concept of difference and otherness that's very difficult to get rid of. And so when you were talking about when we hear these stories, when we read the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, and we read about his aunt being whipped, is there a voyeuristic part of us that begins to focus in on those issues, to the detriment, perhaps, of other issues that are that should be covered at all? So when we think about police violence, when we think about racism in this country, we often look for scapegoats. We often look for people to blame. Usually it's this guy. White police officer who's out there, and believe me, he deserves a lot of the blame. I'm not a huge fan of, well, any police officers, but certainly not racist police officers who use their racist energies and use their worries and their concerns and their fears and take that out on black people. But why is it those instances that get all of the attention? When really, when we think about Fanon, and when he talks about for many reasons we can't breathe, he's not talking about physical violence necessarily. It's in the colonial context, but it's in the context of laws, it's in the context of a community, it's in the context of a culture and an environment that makes it impossible for human beings to be able to live as human beings. And so asking these questions of what is at the root of these causes. Why is it that the media, who we normally will talk about, well, the media doesn't really portray these things, but when all of a sudden they're focusing in on physical violence that's happening against black and brown people, why is there so much attention that's given to that? And what is the consequence of attention being focused there and not in other areas? So we rarely remember these people right here. I don't really know who these people are, but perhaps we see ourselves in there. Because going back to Douglass, going back to slavery, and looking kind of how laws were implemented, in the same chapter that was referred to where the, excuse me, in the same chapter was referred to where Frederick Douglass' aunt is being whipped. In the beginning of that chapter, he starts to talk about the concept of race and where the concept of race comes from. And he says that some statesmen began to say, hey, slavery is going to be over pretty soon. And the reason it's going to be over isn't out of any type of moral obligation or decency on the part of people, but because there's so many light-skinned babies that are beginning to come out that eventually you won't be able to legitimize slavery based on the color of somebody's skin. And he says that when this became clear to the slave owners, when this became clear to the elites, those people whose wealth was attached to the human lives and to the personhood of these individual slaves, he says that they then decreed and by law established that the status of the children will follow the condition of their mothers. Meaning, no matter what shade or color you are, you will be identified as a slave. And this is really where we begin to see kind of this new definition or this new understanding or this creation really of what it means to be racialized in this country. I say that because the laws that were, we often have, in my classes sometimes we'll have these discussions, right? And I'll ask, well, I can ask you all too, has anybody heard, well, everybody's racist. Everybody's prejudiced. Everybody has implicit bias, which is true, but there's a very big difference between my implicit bias or the implicit bias of an African-American young man and the implicit bias of a racist cop who has a gun on his hip and a badge on his chest that allows for him to kill, that allows for him to murder. There's a very big difference in the implicit bias between somebody who has the ability to hire and fire, somebody who has the ability to send a child to the detention, to send a child to the principal, or to call the police on a child who's in school, right? And so understanding that, we have to ask ourselves where these kind of ideas come from, that they're not these normal, natural concepts of viewing human beings, but they're actually historically have been implemented intentionally to create this concept of race, to create the way that we look upon people today, was done deliberately and was done intentionally to benefit a certain group of people and to disenfranchise another group of people. going back to kind of the idea behind this slide and the idea behind police violence and the physical violence perpetrated upon black bodies every day, and stepping back to understand kind of what do I talking about when I'm talking about these people here. Really what I'm alluding to is the kind of the idea of civic engagement. So when I say civic engagement, what's the first idea? What comes to your minds when we talk about civic engagement? Anybody? Voting, right? So usually when we talk about civic engagement, the first thing that comes to people's mind is voting. And our laws, whether it's through the Senate or whether it's through propositions that we vote on, are largely come about through the voting system. Hopefully I'll get an opportunity to talk about kind of where I disagree with that concept of civic engagement and where I think that there's actually dangers in viewing civic engagement only through voting. But as we talked about in Douglas, and as we've seen throughout the years, there's a number of things, right, going back to the title of, of my slide, how the ballot box was used to suffocate or to choke Black America. In 2000, we've heard a lot lately, especially with the elections of the Clintons and kind of super predators and the dehumanization of young black men in this country. But we haven't really had any in-depth conversations about the people who allowed for those laws to be enacted. We haven't had a deep kind of conversation about how many of those laws, particularly in California, which is known as one of the kind of the pioneers of this get tough on crime throughout the nation, how those laws came into being and what were the consequences of those laws. Proposition 21, it was a voter initiative which passed in 2001. I think that's wrong. I think it was 2000. But, you know, I'm not a big fan of numbers, so I could be off. But essentially, Proposition 21 was a proposition that proposed and passed that increased a variety of criminal penalties for crimes committed by youth and incorporated many youth offenders into the adult criminal justice system. I talked earlier about this idea of civic engagement and this idea of voting. And a lot of the time in the communities, I live in Southeast San Diego and we work with, and I have friends with who are still involved in gangs, who are gang members, who've been incarcerated, who are incarcerated. And so the ideas behind voting and whether or not we should vote is an interesting topic. One of the things that we hear a lot, and perhaps you've heard it, is if you don't vote, you can't complain. Has anybody heard that? Another thing that we hear a lot is people have died for your right to vote, right? And so you have to vote. The problem is that many African Americans, many people who may have been social justice minded, many people who understood the concepts of racism voted for this. So voting alone isn't enough. It's also becoming educated and understanding what you're voting for, what the implications are going to be on the people who are directly impacted by these things. And so Proposition 21 passed in 2000 or 2001 and something like that. Is there anybody in here that was born after 1982? I wish. Yesterday there was a lecture going on and he says, anybody, under 24? I was like, why not? and unfortunately in this group of like 200 people, he kind of looked at me, just shook his head and continued the lecture. So people who weren't even alive or people who weren't even 18 at this time, who didn't have an opportunity to vote for this law, who didn't have an opportunity to become educated about that, but whose parents either voted for it or didn't vote at all, nevertheless allowed for this law to pass. Those people who weren't even able to participate in the election at that time, who weren't be able to become civically engaged at that time, were directly impacted by it. The people who were voting on it had no idea what the consequences of this law would be. Most people didn't even read the law, but the consequences became very clear of this law for us in San Diego and personal for us in San Diego and at Pillars of the Community a couple of years ago when, well, you know what, this is my wrong. became very clear for us here in San Diego when the district attorney, Bonnie Dumanis, was able to find an obscure penal code that was a part of Proposition 21, which allowed essentially for any persons who actively participate in any criminal street game as defined in subdivision F blah blah blah, with knowledge that its members engage in or have engaged in a pattern of criminal gang activity as defined in blah blah blah, and who willfully promotes, further assists, or benefits from any felonies criminally abducted by members of that gang, is guilty of conspiracy to commit that felony and may be punished as specified in blah, 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 blah. If you notice, there's a lot of blah, blah, blah happening there that most voters didn't pay any attention to. About 2 years ago, Bonnie Dumanis rounded up 33 African-American men who were originally from San Diego. Some of them were living out of state in Arizona, some were living in Nevada. Rounded these 33 African-American men up, brought them in trial and charged them with 50 years to life. Some of their bails were set at $1.4 million. And in court, Bonnie Dumanis said, we don't think these people committed the crime. There were 9 shootings that happened in San Diego. Out of all of the 9 shootings, only 1 actually hit somebody and injured that person in the leg. They never found the culprits. They never found the people who actually did the shootings. But Bonnie Dumanis said that because of 182.5, we can incarcerate anybody. We can incarcerate anybody who is allegedly associated with the gang that had allegedly committed this crime, and charge them with 50 years to life. In court, they said, we don't think they committed this crime. We don't even think they knew about this crime. But under Penal Code 182.5, we can charge them with it. 33 African-American men who had children. They were brothers. They had jobs. Some of them were full-time students. 33 human beings whose lives were directly impacted by a law that voters passed, that we as voters passed, without even being aware of what the repercussions would be. This is just one example of the ways that the ballot box has been used to prevent black people in this country, black and brown people in this country, from being able to breathe, from being able to survive, from being able to raise their families. This young boy here, his father was one of the people who were incarcerated under it. But there were other people also. Because of the circumstances of this case, actually the CD that that David talked about, the Reclaiming Our Community CD, was a project that we were working at Pillars of the Community with local gang members. And one of the names of the people, one of the names of a local gang member who was a rapper, came up. And so I started asking around to see if we can get him to join the CD and contribute a song. And that's when I found out that he was incarcerated. And when I went to go visit him, in prison, he was like, I don't even know why I'm in here. I don't know what's happening. So I went back outside, and at that time I was working closely with some local nonprofit organizations that have historically sometimes fought for people who are being oppressed. And I'm like, hey, have you heard about this rapper who's being incarcerated and he doesn't know why he's in there? There's something about his rap lyrics that are connecting him to a gang and this and this. And the question that I was asked by some of these social justice organizations was, but are his lyrics misogynistic? Or is he really in a gang? Which again shows how this concept of how the racialization of human beings has impacted kind of our day-to-day lives, and how easy it is even for us progressive people or people who care about social justice to end up getting caught up in all the bullshit, I guess. And sometimes it's just bullshit. So anyways, we found out about We found out about his case and the case of another person named Aaron Harvey, who was a part of one of these 33 African American men. And because of that, we were able to really kind of fight back and bring attention to their case. Eventually, the judge ended up dismissing the case. However, that happened after a number of the young men had already taken plea deals. In the criminal justice system, what you have is you go before the court and the district attorney says, hey, your bail is at $1.5 million. I'm charging you with 50 years to life. But if you take this plea, I'll give you 20 years. If you take this plea, I'll give you 10 years. And they had approached both Brandon Tiny Duncan, this is the rapper here, and Aaron Harvey with those cases. But because there was support from the community for them, because they had families who were there to support them, they are a couple of the few people who actually didn't take a plea deal. But there's people, so eventually a judge dropped their case, but unfortunately a number of the people who were on trial had already accepted plea deals. So right now there's people who are doing up to 20 years in prison. And have accepted felonies that are on their records and will always be on their records that can't be taken away retrospectively. I apologize for the coughing. You know what? I have some water here, actually. So, let's see if I can do both at the same time. So earlier we talked about this idea of civic engagement. And one of the things when we're talking in the community and working with people who've been incarcerated or people who are still very active in the street life is, I'm not here to tell you to vote. I'm not here to tell you to play the game that has been put out for us. But I am here because, again, people did vote for Proposition 21. But I am here to tell you, I'm not here to tell you to play the game, but I do want you to learn how not to get played. And in order to know how not to get played, you need to read, you need to get educated and find out about a lot of the voter initiatives. You need to find out about the propositions that are being voted that may impact you and may impact people who will be coming through. But this idea of civic engagement alone being voting isn't enough. After Brandon, Tiny Duncan, and Aaron Harvey got out, they continued to be active, and they continued to try to draw attention to their case. And in large part because of the work that they did and because of the work we did at Pillars of the Community. Assemblymember Dr. Shirley Weber ended up passing a bill through the Senate, or ended up getting an audit of cow gangs. How many people are aware kind of what cow gangs is? So there's a database, there's a statewide database in California that people get added to a list. It's actually interesting for a number of different reasons. But anyways, they become documented as a gang member. It's interesting for a number of reasons. One, because it's bullshit. But two, because even if somebody is a gang member, that's not against the law. Even if somebody is a gang member, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be, have the same rights as any other human being in the country. And I avoid saying having the same kind of civil rights as everybody, but as African Americans in this country have known, being considered a citizen doesn't necessarily guarantee you will be treated as a human being. At any rate, these are the criteria in California or inside San Diego, and there's small variations between cities of how somebody can become a documented gang member. Some of them are fairly simple and straightforward, for example, admitting to be a gang member. But then you have other ones here. Subject has been seen affiliating with already known gang members.
The one right above it, by an untested informant.
Yeah, so subject has been identified by a tested informant, and then afterwards, subjects have been identified by untested informants. So anybody can say, hey, he or she is a gang member.
Not reliable sources.
And unreliable sources. But even without that, all you need to meet is, depending on the city, 2 or 3 of these criteria in order to become documented as a gang member.
And then, I'm sorry, I just have to interrupt here because I'm seeing the one that displays hand signs. Hello, I'm deaf.
Yeah,
If I walk down the street and I was a person of color, shit.
yeah.
Think about it. I'm signing.
No, it's totally true. In fact, some of the pieces on the my wife calls me, is this loser? Is that loser? My wife calls me a loser all the time, but she could unfortunately become documented from Lincoln Park gang, right? By doing a simple sign like that. But it's even worse than that. Because he's been seen affiliating with already known gang members. What areas, there's areas inside of San Diego that are documented areas. So they document entire areas of San Diego. For example, Lincoln Park. You can't escape. So the area that you're living in could be documented as a gang area. What areas of town do you think those tend to be in?
Logan?
Poor, so yes, Logan. Poor, predominantly black and brown communities. There aren't any documented gangs in La Jolla. There aren't any documented gangs.
There are gangs in La Jolla, just not documented gangs that we're familiar
There's no documented, right, there's no documented. In fact, there's no documented white gangs in San Diego. So the people who end up being impacted by this, right, are people, poor people, people of color who are living in communities that are typically impoverished. So if the person who you go to school with, right, and you're walking to school with is a documented gang member, and you're seen talking to that person, that counts as one of these criteria. Subject has been seen displaying symbols and or hand signs. I'm not going to ask you to show, but I've seen a lot of people have tattoos nowadays, right? So a tattoo, for example, of a 4-leaf clover, right, could be enough to document you from Lincoln Park. Subject has been seen frequenting gang areas. If you live in a gang area, it's difficult not to frequent it. If you have relatives who live in a gang area, it's difficult not to be seen in it. Subject has been seen wearing gang dress. Guess what gang dress is? Blue.
A specific
Youth
color
fashion.
shirt or pants.
Any youth
That's right.
fashion. Yeah.
Blue. Anybody wearing blue in here?
Or red.
Red, right? Green, blue, red. Depending on the city, there's all different types of things. So it's virtually impossible not to become documented as a gang member if they're looking to document you. So if you meet 2 of these criteria, that was enough for the police to go ahead and write you up. How this impacted families, how this impacted neighborhoods, how this impacted all of these things is interesting. But getting back to kind of the original point, after Brandon and Aaron were released and they were going around to different churches and different organizations to talk about their experience, there was one question that was always asked. And it wasn't, did you commit the crime? It was, yes, but are you a gang member? So even though these criteria are all ridiculous, even if they are gang members, what does that have to do with anything? If you commit a crime, you should pay the consequences. But being black, being poor, living in a neighborhood, none of these things should necessarily, by law, define you as less than anybody else. Recently, there was a police shooting in Vista. I forgot the name of the person who was murdered. But the first thing that they said was a documented gang member was killed. Once you're documented as a gang member, you lose any type of real citizenship, any type of real rights that other human beings in this country have. So in addition to being black and brown and facing all of those different obstacles, now you also are taken to an extra level where people today will say that's messed up that that black person was beaten by the police. But there's very few people that will say that's messed up that that gang member was beaten up by police. There's very few people that says that that gang member shouldn't have been killed by police, even though these are extremely ridiculous. So because of a lot of these things and working closely with Assembly Member Weber, eventually there was an audit. Inside of that audit of California Gang Database, It looked at over 150,000 individuals that were documented as gang members. 3 minutes. While only 6.6% of Californians are African American and just 38% are Latino, nearly 20% of the people in the database are African American and 66% are Latino. 94% of them are male. There were, I forgot how many, something like around 30 or 40 9-year-olds that were documented as gang members. There were a number of 1-year-olds that were documented as gang members. Now, it wasn't police driving down the street and seeing like Boss Baby wearing the wrong color, but probably it was computer glitches or something like that. But those names were still on the gang database. Because of that, eventually Assemblymember Weber came up with proposed AB 2298, which was recently passed the Senate, which requires a notification process for adults where they are documented by law enforcement, requires an appeal process to contest documentation, and requires systems of accountability for how agencies determine documentation. This is all very recent. None of these things, this is just within the last year, really. And even though the law passed, the question of implementation is actually really difficult. We recently, in San Diego, you can look up the case of, I forgot his name right now, but it will come eventually. In large part due to the audit and in large part due to AB 2298.
Is there independent oversight on that?
There has not been. There has been no oversight at all. And so that's one of the things that they're fighting for. Ending on some good news. So recently the California Attorney General posted this online that pursuant to Assembly Bill, I think that says AB 90, we can't read that at all. I apologize. Anyways, the gang database has been put on hold. So currently they're not adding anybody to the gang database, but that's temporary. It's until they figure out the kinks and all of that. All that to say, back to Fanon, that we have to ask ourselves, what is our role to play in understanding how the laws go about, reading through the bills, understanding which laws are coming forward in the elections that are coming up. There's actually a couple of them. One of them is, I asked somebody the name of the bill and they didn't get back to me yet, so. But anyways, recently there have been some positive steps forward. For example, Proposition 47 and Proposition 57. But now there's a huge push to kind of roll back a lot of those gains. A lot of money, including from Costco, Ralph's, and a number of other stores are donating a lot of money to pass a bill that's called something like Californians for Safety and Justice Bill. Which essentially is saying we need to continue to punish black and brown people and not allow some of these gains that have been made. Anyways, there's a lot more that I could be talking about. Oh, wait. I have a picture with myself in it. I had to put that up there, too, just because I wanted to have a picture of myself. But that's it. I'm really looking forward to the conversation part of it and whatever questions people may have. Are we waiting on those? Yeah, if somebody has a question, please ask me, because I would love to answer it.
Because, we have an hour and 15 minutes for that session, and one of my feelings is that some people might take...
Don't leave. Don't leave.
So why don't we take, if people are willing, 10 minutes now to ask a few questions of these speakers, and that might come off the time later. We can flip. Yeah.
Oh, that'll work, too.
Yeah.
So, Nirmal, are you open to...
Yes, for either one of us. There's a question in the back.
It wasn't really a question, but I was just wondering if you could elaborate more on that CD that you guys were talking about.
If what?
If you could just talk a little more about the CD you were talking about.
Yeah.
What
So again, I live in Southeast San Diego. I didn't talk a lot about pillars of the community. This keeps going out.
If you hold it too far down, it covers the antenna. Yeah.
Here we go.
There you go.
All right. So I had some friends of mine who had recently gotten out of prison who were also Muslim. They became Muslim while being incarcerated, but also had very strong street reputations and were also rappers. The most well-known of them is Black Mikey. And so I had this idea. I was like, we were out demonstrating one day. I think it was after Trayvon Martin And I was like, man, you know what, this is like a movement. Every movement needs a soundtrack. Let's see if we can come up with a soundtrack. So I spoke to him and to some other people, and they started talking to some of their friends. One of the interesting things about being incarcerated is the racial segregation that's in there actually ends up uniting people who would not normally unite. So for example, if you're black and one of you is a Crip, and when I'm talking about Crip in this context, wearing blue Crips, and there's a blood there, but there's a riot between the Mexican inmates or the white inmates, then you're going to unite together. So a lot of these people who were incarcerated in the mid-90s and early 2000s are getting out of prison now. They have these street reputations, but they've already been working with other gang members. So because a lot of those ties, these OGs or triple OGs, were able to kind of reach out across boundaries that normally they wouldn't do, and work with one another on creating this CD. All of the songs were really about pushing towards positivity. And so I told them there's nothing wrong with being a gang member. I believe that firmly. There's nothing wrong with being a gang member. It's what are the actions that you're doing for it? So tell the whole story. Just be honest. There's benefits in being a gang member, right? But also talk about, you know, what were your experiences being incarcerated? It's not all fun and games. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, yeah.
If you Google Reclaiming the Community CD, you'll find some stuff also.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was just thinking maybe the fact that there are some private prisons and there's like an amount of prisoners that had to go to jail, and this market idea and neoliberal had something to do in the way that these bodies, these specific bodies, are targeted towards these specific uses.
Right. Well, I mean, what was slavery at its root? Right? Slavery wasn't just a bunch of white people that didn't like black people.
Yeah.
Right? It was an economic system. There were people that were benefiting from it, that were making money from it. And at that time, they were able to make money by having black people labor in the fields. Today, you can make money by incarcerating black bodies. It's between $40,000 and $60,000 a year to incarcerate one person. So it's a huge money-making machine. So not only because of the private prisons, but private prisons have made it even worse. But because of private prisons, because of state prisons, there's a huge incentive to incarcerate people. And those are the people, it's the police unions and the guard unions are actually the people who are behind some of the initiatives to push some of these voter initiatives and state laws that make it easier to incarcerate people. Yes?
I wanted to add on that also. If you have a child who has the unfortunate circumstance to have to go to juvie, who do you think pays for it? Who pays for that? Nothing? The parents. Whoever are the legal guardians, they are sent a bill and they are responsible for paying for their child to be in the juvenile justice system and to be in juvenile hall.
Yeah.
And if the parents can't pay, their wages are garnished. It's a no-win situation, and there's no relief.
Oh, well, it's a no-win situation. I think this is what you're saying. It's a no-win situation for the people that are directly impacted, but it's a win-win situation for those people who are benefiting from it financially, right?
Exactly that, yes.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Is that Leroy? I think we have a mutual friend, DJ Cutting Candy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us directly how did your work touch the disabled community?
With which community?
The disabled community.
How have I worked with the disabled community?
Yeah, or how does your work touch the disabled community? I haven't heard that through your presentation.
So that's a good question. So at Pillars, it's not a part of our mission specifically to work with the disabled community. But as some of the presenters who, I think particularly the gentleman who came before our session alluded to, the amount of people who are impacted by the criminal justice system and incarcerated, many of them are people who had IEPs when they were going to school, and because they don't have the resources that are necessary, end up, it's like an easy way to just kind of, to dismiss other human beings. What's interesting for me is looking at kind of, and again, this is just me because that's not my area of focus, is looking at the similarities kind of between kind of this, the idea of empowerment and disabilities. So at one time in this country, being labeled as black or considering yourself, looking at yourself and seeing yourself black was considered a disability, right? But through the Black Power movement, right, there was this kind of embrace of what it means to be black. And I think that you see that, and again, I'm not an expert, but I think you see that a lot in the disabled community, for lack of a better word, of this, hey, there's nothing wrong with us. There's not something wrong with me. There's something wrong with the society that I'm in that is preventing me from reaching my full potential, right? And so looking at kind of that intersectionality is something that I'm really interested in. I know most of the people who we work with at Pillars would be labeled as having disabilities in some shape or form. But that's never really a part of our conversation, per se.
We have time for one more question. Yeah.
I mean, the executors of these laws are the police, right? So I was wondering in how far it is embedded in how policemen are trained
Yeah.
in their react, and how much the law at the end can change when the attitude is so entrenched in the minds of the people who execute the law.
I'm glad you said that, because one of the points, as I was kind of thinking about this, you know, the police suck, don't get me wrong. But the people who we elect and the laws that we pass are the ones who enable them to do the things that they're doing. And as long as our direction is only on the police who are doing these things, there's very little that's going to be done because there's no enforcement. But as soon as politicians actually start caring about these things, as soon as voters start actually caring about these laws that are being proposed and that are, you know, being voted on, there's not going to be any real changes. To directly answer your question, though, the education for police is kind of a joke. I mean, it's kind of like Starbucks taking 4 hours off to teach all of their employees to not be racist, right? I mean, racism in this country is something that's very serious, and it's been there for a long time. And it's not easy to talk about. Eric Holder, right, he gave Attorney General, he gave a talk where he said that America is a nation of cowards. Essentially, we're a nation of cowards because we've refused to have real conversations around race. So forget the police, even in my classrooms. As soon as you say black people, as soon as you say white people, everybody starts acting like they've been locked up for 10 years. Right? They start looking around, turning their pins into shanks, getting ready to stab each other. I'm like, what just happened, right? Because we can't have those conversations. The training for police is absolutely horrible. They talk about implicit bias. I sat in a couple of their trainings, and it's a joke. But I don't think training is the solution to any of this. I think we have to have laws where police are punished for hurting people, for disrespecting people. We haven't even talked about disrespect. We talk about people killed. We talk about people being beaten. We don't talk about the disrespect that occurs on a daily basis. Is anybody in here from Logan or Southeast? Yeah? Have you ever been pulled over by the police?
Yeah.
Do you remember any of the questions they asked you?
It wasn't in Southeast. I was actually in Linda Vista at the time with my brother and his friend. But the reason they pulled us over is because we looked like someone that they were looking for.
Okay, right. So I grew up in Linda Vista. But in Southeast San Diego, I've been pulled over a number of times before we were doing this work. Now that we've been doing this work, mysteriously, we don't get pulled over as much. But there's two questions that I've been asked that I've never been asked in any other part of San Diego. One is, are you a documented gang? Are you a gang member?
Oh, yeah.
And two, are you a fourth waiver? You know what a fourth waiver is? Fourth waiver is people who've been incarcerated, and upon release with a felony, they sign a waiver that is waiving their Fourth Amendment rights. So essentially, anybody who is on parole is a fourth waiver. they don't have Fourth Amendment rights, meaning the police can then take you out of the car, they can search your area of the vehicle, they can detain you for 3 or 4 hours or any of those types of things. But those are constantly the questions that you're being asked and being pulled over for no reason at all. There's a gang, GSU, the Gang Suppression Unit in Southeast San Diego. They drive around like Rampart Division, pulling people over and asking them, are you gang members? And just hassling people. Literally for no reason at all. So it's frustrating.
I also wanted to respond to the question when you asked about training police, and I was going to, I know Leroy may talk about that later on in his thing, because the issue of when you talk about training at the intersections of race and disability, it actually produces more surveillance. So that the suggestions they're now making for, if you're considered to be both black and autistic, basically they want to put basically like the yellows, those kinds of like badges of infamy on you, or it's also then used, like the training cannot take away the kind of the ways in which disabled people are already produced as dangerous, and especially at those intersections. So as you know, that if you were black and mentally ill, have some kind of mental illness, the chances of no amount of training can change the kinds of constructions, historical constructions that are there. So notice that the man who recently, the white man without trousers who shot somebody in Waffle, 4 black people, a white man who shot 4 black people in Nashville, was not there's no, whatever training you did in mental illness still allowed him to be safe, but that if those bodies were at the intersections, so this issue of training is we kind of like use it as a mode, but if we cannot understand race and disability in this kind of complex intersectional space, then no amount of training is going to be able to tell you how to act right.